Today, Sharon and I are painting this fabulous wreck at the Salt Cafe. If you would like to see more of our general conversation and Sharon's painting, then I'll leave the link to that down in the description. We are not far from Portsmouth, which you can see in the distance over there, and it was a glorious day, but it was quite windy. We had a really lovely time.
I don't know what they're like. Oh my goodness.
Scared the life out of me.
That's what I'm after, to be honest with you. It's getting the angles right on this one, isn't it? It's just
It's
really
deciding
tricky.
how much to do. Really is deciding how much, because I quite like all the gubbins around it, but I also quite like a close-up of a part of it.
Oh yeah.
Too complicated.
Help!
Don't know what to do anymore. And anybody would think this is a public cafe because people have got us sat in front of us outside.
Yes.
In front of our view.
Yeah, what's the curve? It's got a very round bottom, isn't it?
Excuse me, is there anything wrong in this world with the round bottom?
No, I've got one of those.
So, I'm wetting my sky.
Splutter, splutter.
No, don't choke on me. The sky is so beautiful now. If it weren't windy, I would definitely have opted for sitting outside.
Of course, yeah.
So I'm putting some blue in here. I'm using a mixture of an ultramarine, and the colour I've got is called peacock blue, but it's a brighter blue, so it could be a cobalt, you could use a phthalo or an intense blue. I'm just putting that in onto the wet background. And then I am searching for another brush. I'm going to go for a slightly smaller brush here, and I'm using this damp just to lift some of the colour around and push it around. So I'm putting in a bit of extra blue, and then I'll clean my brush in a minute and I'll lift some bits out. So it's just using this smaller brush to have a bit more detail. So this is a technique I love doing, which is feathering the edge of the cloud. I like the way it sort of just lifts a little bit of the colour up. So I'll carry on just lifting around. There were some beautiful shadows under these clouds, so I've used here a mixture of ultramarine and umber just to give me this soft grey. And I also added a little bit of silver in there, which just gives it a tiny touch of sparkle. Just dropping that in to the underside of the clouds just to give me some shadow. And just building that up. Whilst the paper's still wet, you've got a bit of time to work this. Just lifting out a little puddle. I don't want to have a ridge of water on the bottom because that can soak back up into your sky. Just wanted to make this a little bit whiter. And then I did what I tell everybody not to do, is I carried on working when the paper was getting dry. So I'm having to rapidly re-wet everything, and it's not going to be the same sky afterwards, and I'm really annoyed with myself. But I'm having to just deal with it, put some more colour in, and it is what it is. Again, just put bits of colour in, and before it dries off, just push those edges around. Not as happy with it as I was before, but I've done it now, so I just have to deal with it. And just trying to lift those little edges, those flicks again, but I've lost some of them. There's definite knack in knowing when to stop what you're doing. And despite the fact that I can see it in other people, I'm just the same as everybody else, and I don't always notice in myself when I'm just working too far and I should really have stopped. So I need to come in and add some of the trees that are on the other side of the estuary. So I have got a green here, but there's an awful lot of ultramarine gone into that green. I want to make it really neutral green, not bright, not colourful, so that it will look like it's on the other side of the estuary, that it's distant. I'm going to add a bit of a darker green at the base just to give some shape to it, but I really don't want to add too much detail to it at this point. It's just to put the boat into a context, which at this point I couldn't really see exactly where the boat was because I had people sitting in front of me. But we hoped it was in the right place. So in front of the trees we've got a little bit of mud flats at the edge of the estuary. The tide changed quite dramatically during the time we were there as well. Using quite a neutral colour here on these boats. Again, don't want to put a huge amount of detail, it's just suggesting at things just to put a context for the painting. So again, just putting in some shadows on the mudflats on the estuary on the other side. And then a little bit of the water. So I'm coming in now with a darker colour to put shadow on one side of the boat and underneath them, just to give these little boats a bit more shape, a bit more solidity. But again, you know, they're behind the boat, they're there to give context, they're not detailed. And I've got a little bit at the end of the pier, there's a building at the end of the dock here. I can't see a huge amount of it, so I'm just going to suggest all of this on the painting. You just need to make it look busy in the back. The boat was laying on its side on some mudflats, and it's clear that the mudflats hadn't changed much for a while because there was loads and loads of this green algae. So I'm using a sap green with a little bit of ultramarine in it, and I just wanted to get the suggestion that this boat was laying in this mudflats of algae. And I'm using dry brushings. I'm just trying to catch the surface of the paper, so it's not a smooth layer of this algae, it's this broken layer, which I think is quite exciting. So I'm just coming back into these boats now. Now it's all dried off, I can add a little bit more detail and put some stronger colours on there. Just a bit of definition, a bit of shadow, a bit of shaping. And a bit of the mess. You need like just little marks and things just to make it look interesting. So, sorry my hand's in the way, but I'm just adding now the structure of the dock that was going along here, so you'll see it in a second. But just putting some of the wooden structure up around the boats, in and between them. So I'm coming back into the estuary and the mudflats around the boat, And I'm now using a more brown colour, so it's again ultramarine and umber, but this time it's got more of the umber in there. Excuse me. And I'm dry brushing this around where the algae is, which I'll come back in and add to later, but for now this is just starting to build those layers. I'm desperate to get onto the boat, but I've still got the people sitting in front of me, so I can't really see it very well yet, but I will get to it in a minute. So I'm just continuing to build the layers on this estuary, on the mudflats. And so this is, again, ultramarine and umber. It's just a stronger mix, so it becomes darker. And this starts to build those textures and the layers within the surface. And then I've cleaned my brush out and I'm just using a damp brush to pull the paint around to get rid of any edges that I don't want and to push it where I want it to be. Just continuing to play, really. So I'm starting to add the structures in behind the boat. Now I can finally see them. There's some buildings on the dock, and I don't know what all of this is. I don't need to know what all of it is. I'm just looking at the shapes and the marks and putting the boat into some sort of a context here. See harbour boats, harbour buildings of some sort. I don't know whether they're stores or I don't know. It doesn't really matter. I'm using here mixtures again of my ultramarine and my umber, so some are browner, some are bluer, some are greyer, a bit more neutral. The brush I'm using here is a number 8 round, and the paper I'm using is a Bockingford £140 knot, and for me that it's a kind of bomb-proof paper because it allows you to do what you need to do. I've been pulling the paint around, and on some heavier weight papers they're very absorbent, so they don't allow you to do so much of that sort of pulling and pushing of the paint, which I so love doing. So I'm now adding some of the masts that were behind the boat on the other side of the dock, all around across the estuary, and all of these little marks just give interest and suggestion to the painting. So it makes your brain think that there's lots of boats there, but there's not. So there are some other buildings along behind our wreck, so I'm just starting to suggest putting those in with the sun hitting that roof. And again, there was all sorts of things on the roof. I don't know what they were, don't need to know. There's just pipes and poles and different things. We've got the top of that roof, and then there's the shadow at the end. Just increasing the little shadows and the dark marks around the other buildings. It's always a fiddle. You always continually go back to things and just dot and dash and fiddle, but that's okay. So I'm finally getting to start putting the colour on the wreck itself. And it was a really interesting boat because there are so many different colours on there, so many different layers of paint and decay and algae and all sorts of things on there. So it was a really interesting set of colours and a really difficult one to start layering. But that's exactly what I'm going to do, is I'm going to layer it and build it. So I have to start somewhere by putting some of these colours down. And the top of it was this glorious green. Again, I'm using the dry brushing method by putting my brush very flat on the paper and just skimming it across the surface of the texture. And then lower down we had these warmer colours. There was pinks and yellows and ochres. We had the hull, the shape of the hull going around, and I was just trying to start looking at some of those shapes and textures too. So I've picked up my pencil here. Now I can see the boat a little bit better. I just needed to refine a few of my drawing marks. It wasn't far out, but I just needed to tweak a couple of little bits to make the rest of the painting easier to do. There was a beautiful sort of emeraldy green layer at the top of the boat, and I was playing around with colours to mix for it, but I ended up using a sap green mixed with some cerulean, which gave me this sort of slightly emeraldy colour, which was beautiful. So just playing with that along the top of the boat. Just using a little bit of it for drawing and shaping. It was time to be brave. We needed to start adding the shadows in because it is quite shaded, the lower half of this boat. And I just had to go for it. Just got to keep building those darks. It's that contrast that makes it interesting. But this was quite scary, putting this amount of dark in. So now comes a really dark area. This again, it's just ultramarine and umber, but it's using it very, very concentrated. And there was some really dark shadows in and around. There was a little bit on the edge of the boat here as well, reflected shadow. It really makes it stand out when you start putting these poppy areas of dark contrast. And again, just adding in the context, there were shadows behind it, there was the quayside, the dock behind it. So this was just quite a dark area, but not quite as dark as the shadow. So it's again getting that balance right so that one thing stands out against the other. Sort of planking along the edge of the dock itself, which again I'm sure I will add into in a moment. And whilst I've got some of this dark, I will just add it to the mud flats. So now we've got to the point where we come to what I call the fun bit, and this is adding all the little details. And this boat had so many little bits of history that it'd been through in its life, and all of these showed on the hull. So there were broken bits, there were planks missing, there were bits where it had been boarded up, there were functioning gaps along the side, which I'm sure were to do with something that it was used for when it was being used, when it was actually on the water. So it was just looking through for all these little notches and marks and shadows and all the things that make it interesting. It was what appealed to us in the first place about this old boat. If boats could talk, this must have had quite a life. And there was planking along the boat, but I'm not really here trying to create individual planks. It's more about the overall history and life of the boat. And now the shadows that I put in before have dried off. It's clear that I need to strengthen them up and add some more shadows to it. And this is mainly my ultramarine and umber mix. I may have started adding a bit of something like a Payne's grey into there just to take that shadow really deep, really strong. But it was mostly the ultramarine and the umber, and the shadow was achieved by just adding more colour, more pigment. And I'm putting a bit more in just to shape the boat. Again, this is the beauty of that Bockingford paper, is that you can really pull the paint around. So I put the paint on, and then I'm cleaning my brush and I'm using a damp brush just to pull it around. And the Bockingford does that so well. I really feel we're beginning to get the shape of this boat coming in now. Using my brush strokes in different directions just to try and create that shaping. And there's a sort of grey patch on the side of the boat, and it looked like, literally it was a patch, it looked like somebody had nailed an extra plank on the outside. I'm sure it's more complex than that, but that's what it looked like to me. As ever, I've gone back and I'm fiddling with other little bits around. Again, it's just adding strength in where I feel it's necessary. It's little dinks and marks. Rolling my sleeves up, definitely getting serious here. Now, the Salt Cafe where we were sat whilst we were painting this could not have been more lovely with us. We were looked after royally. They came and bought us coffee and cake continuously, as requested. And we were intending initially to sit outside, but it was so windy on this particular day that we went into the cafe, and they were very generous and kind in allowing us to sit at the end of the cafe for the whole time that we did this painting, taking up space, and they were very, very kind. I'll put a link to their details in the description of the video as well. And it's this sort of detail. This is what attracted me to this scene, was all the detail and the gunk and the shadows and the colours on the boat. So this is the bit I kind of get lost in, and I thoroughly enjoy doing, and I'm just pottering away very happily. Nobody at the cafe knows the history of this boat. Apparently it's been there for a very long time. The ladies we were speaking to didn't know who owned it or how long it had been there, but they'd never seen anything happening to it, so quite a sad end for a boat, but it made a beautiful view for us. And lots of little marks, little bits of mark making. Just being very careful here, lifting out little bits of paint. So I've got a damp brush and I'm just repeatedly going over the same area just to lift a bit of colour off to add a highlight, just to make something stand out just that little bit more. Again, it's just that light against dark just makes it more visible. Thoroughly enjoyed this bit. Again, where I've added a little bit of shadow, I'm using my damp brush to lift a bit of the paint next to it just to make it stand out a little more. Thank you so much for joining me. This is where I ended up. Don't forget to subscribe and give me a thumbs up. Thank you very much, and see you next time.